The advice I give people is, listen, email traffic or text traffic, that's good for information sharing, right? Here's some information, please review, let's discuss. When you get into like negotiating, ideally be in person with people. I think that is the best way to develop relationships and add value.
Welcome to the Leader's Edge podcast. I'm Sandy Laycox, editor-in-chief of Leader's Edge. In this podcast, recorded on-site at the Council's Insurance Leadership Forum earlier this month, I talk with Dan Fortin, President of Specialty at QBE North America. The focus of our conversation is relationships, which is a fitting conversation for the biggest relationship building meeting in the property casualty industry. I start by asking Dan to tell us about some early key relationships in his career.
Thanks for this topic. I really enjoy talking about relationships and the importance in the insurance industry. I mean, so many times it's overlooked. People really focus on the technical aspects of insurance. But if you really want to succeed in the industry, relationships really, really matter, much like any industry in terms of networking. And so for me, I was very fortunate, probably more lucky than good early in my career, because some of the key relationships sort of fell in my lap. I was a very young underwriter in 1991. The company I was working for at the time made a decision to really double down on the line of business that I was specializing in, and they brought in some industry-leading talent. Of course, at the time, I didn't know any better, but these folks really helped me understand, obviously, the A, B, and C's of underwriting, the importance of them, but also the relationship aspect of them, how important it is to demonstrate empathy, to really understand what the customer values and what the broker values. And again, these folks really helped me accelerate those relationships because they had relationships in place for 10 years that they introduced me to. And so I was able to really fast track my relationship network with the broker community in the early 90s.
Yeah. Do you feel like that kind of mentorship is still going on in the industry today?
It's going on. It's available. I think people have to be more intentional about it, right? You know, I was lucky. I wasn't intentional about it. I think, if you really want to forge your own path, you have to be much more intentional about really understanding and appreciating the value of relationships and to leverage those mentors that can help you accelerate those. Because building them on your own, it's possible, but certainly a lot more challenging than it is to leverage off of people that you're working for, you're working with. You can really accelerate those relationships.
I then asked Dan to describe a relationship that has changed the way he does business. And from there, we discussed how relationship building has changed, especially since the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I was, again, fortunate early on. The geography that I was attached to, there was a brokerage shop that really invested heavily in their brokerage talent. And so there was a lot of senior brokers that I was initially introduced to really help me. They helped me understand, I think to put it as directly as I can, is you can't win all the time. At the end of the day, you have to get comfortable with compromise. And so as a young, very competitive underwriter, I wanted everything my way all of the time. They helped me understand that you can still win in the long term by compromise, and very specifically, it could be when you're underwriting an account, you may not be able to get the premium, the retention, the limits, all of those aspects perfect, but as long as they're good enough, and good enough to me is not settling, it's just understanding there's certain times that you sort of take your chips off the table. And so I was fortunate to have a few brokers that really helped me understand that. They were 10, 20 years older than me at the time. So wisdom was imparted upon me, and I was smart enough to actually accept that. I've also learned from people that I've hired over the years or I've managed, people that I've asked to take risk, which when I reflect back, I don't know if I was willing to take the same risk, right? So there was a situation where I was looking to hire somebody for an underwriting leadership role, and she had only a claims leadership role. And so when I tried to convince her, she sort of flipped the switch on me and said, "What would you do in this situation?" And I didn't have an answer for her at the time because I had never been put in that position. But years later, I was put in that position, and I reflected back on that, saying sometimes you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in order to grow in your career. And so those types of relations I've learned from people that are years older than me. I've learned from people that are years younger than me.
I think that is such a great point that you have been able to learn from, the colleagues that work for you as well as those you work for. I learn a lot from my team, so.
Maturity, right? Early on in my career, I probably would not have been secure enough to do that. As you grow in the industry and you grow as a person, I think I've matured in understanding what I don't know and become more comfortable that I'll never know everything.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about relationship building since the pandemic. How do you see, particularly for the youngest generation in the industry, how do you see them building relationships, especially those folks that have come in since 2020? And then what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, is like being intentional. You have to be more intentional. Again, I'll date myself. When I started underwriting in the early 90s, no cell phones. I didn't even have email at the time, right? So the only way I could communicate was pick up the phone or have a meeting with somebody at the time. So it was easier for them. You had to have those relationships. Now, especially with the pandemic, people got much more comfortable with virtual meetings. The level of communication that takes place via text or email or other vehicles is a lot. And you have to be really intentional around what's the proper way to communicate and what's the proper channel and how do you communicate. And the advice I give people is, listen, email traffic or text traffic, that's good for information sharing, right? Here's some information, please review, let's discuss. We're going to meet at this time. So things that are basically informational, fact-based. When you get into like negotiating, right? You need to ideally be in person with people. I think that is the best way to develop relationships and develop and add value. An example that I use in terms of the importance of understanding customers and empathizing is, early in my career as an excited young underwriter, I couldn't wait to rush into my manager's office and start talking about the risk business. This is the risk, and fortunately for me, my manager at the time would say, hold on, Dan, tap the brakes a little bit here. First of all, what's the customer want? Why are they submitting? Before you start assessing their risk profile, why don't you ask the question, what do you want me to solve for you? And then once you understand how you can add value, then you can go pursue the what part of that. What do I need to do? And can I get comfortable adding that type of value? That's how you build those relationships, is like, many underwriters will rush to open up a submission and start underwriting it, as opposed to pick up the phone, ask the broker, why did you send it to me? What do you want to accomplish? How can I add value? So the follow-ups are really important. So my advice is leverage all of the electronic communication that you can, but do not leave on the table the value of that interaction over the phone or in person, and then take it to the next level if you can, socially, especially when you're young. Our business is so much about trust, right? And it's trust and respect. And you need to sort of develop those interpersonal relationships to, develop that trust.
Next, we discuss the key attributes of broker-carrier relationships.
My advice to underwriters is understand the importance of and the value of a relationship. Understand that not every relationship is an easy one either. And don't ignore the ones that are more challenging. In my experience, and early in my career, it was a lot easier to not even pick up the phone with a broker I didn't like or didn't respect. But I found it more challenging later in my career. I said, listen, if I can, maybe we're not going to be the best of friends, but at least there's a mutual level of respect there. And we're responsive and people are picking up the phone and responding to me. That is a huge win. So my advice is, it's not everything is going to be easy for us, but sometimes the more challenging things are the more rewarding opportunities.
Within the complex world of the specialty business, relationships can also be more complex. I asked Dan to describe how the risk affects the type of relationship building with the broker and policyholder.
It's a good question. I'm biased because when you say specialty, we think we're special, right? So, but there are unique features of special. When I think about specialty lines of business, I think lines of business that are are less homogenous, right? Less cookie cutter, so to speak. And they really require an understanding of the particular risk, the particular broker. It's more work because you really have to do more things than just, pick up an underwriting file, look at exposures, put a quote together. You have to really understand what the customer and broker value to put yourself in the best position to win. And some specialty lines require a lot more customer intimacy or interaction than others. There's some lines of business where an underwriter will never meet the actual buyer of the policy. I grew up in the directors and officers liability business where we dealt with a lot of publicly traded companies. And as a very young underwriter, I was really intimidated because I was meeting with C-suite executives as a little 24-year-old underwriter. It made me work a whole lot harder to be prepared for those meetings and show up. So that really takes customer intimacy to a different level. And one observation I will make about our industry in general, if you look at the leadership really across the industry, you'll see a pretty heavy population of people that actually grew up in the D&O business.
Oh, really?
Yes. A lot of the CEOs, C-suite execs, insurance companies, and brokers grew up in the financial lines or D&O area. And I think part of that is because of the interactions you had with C-suite executives early in your career. Because think about being a director or an officer at a publicly traded company. One of your top insurance buys is D&O liability, right? And so you really have a vested interest in understanding who's underwriting you. Can you trust them as an underwriter? Can you trust them as providing claims capacity when and if needed?
Finally, coming back to the meeting buzzing around us, I asked Dan about the relationships he has built at ILF over the years and the ones he is still hoping to develop.
Yeah, I would say in terms of, I've been fortunate because I've had so much interaction. I grew up with a lot of people in this industry. I'm my 35th year in the D&O, the insurance industry, growing up as a D&O underwriter. So a lot of the people I see here, I grew up within the industry, and I have a ton of relationships here. And obviously events like this create the opportunity to enhance those relationships. But in terms of, relationships I want to develop, I grew up in the retail distribution network. Most of my relationships are with your major brokers, local brokers, that deal directly with clients. I have an interest, and our company has an interest in enhancing our relationships with wholesale distribution brokers and also the MGA program managers. And so that's a particular set of distribution partners that we're spending a disproportionate amount of time with in the interest of growing those relationships and growing and diversifying our business.
That was Dan Fortin, President of Specialty at QBE North America, talking with me during the 2025 Insurance Leadership Forum. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. For more from ILF, go to leadersedge.com.